the scientist.
The fight is that the blood of 1,000 men and women was spilled within these walls. Limbs twisted and broken, eyes gouged from bloody sockets, flesh burned black.
Please. No way for death. In death, there are no accidents, no coincidences, no mishaps, and no escapes. What you have to realize is that we're all just a mouse that a cat has by the tail.
The number you have reached, 911, has been changed to a non-public number.
Tonight is Monday, December 18th. Morning. The following show contains conservative posturing, radical Christian ideas, and may offend pagans, Wiccans, Islamic fundamentalists, and other unenlightened individuals. Callers and guests may be subjected to brash and offensive comments by the hosts and any other type of bullying tactics available. But that's okay. We know why you're here.
This concludes this test of the emergency broadcast system.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. Where's the music?
Hello, welcome to World of the Unexplained. Oh, there's the music. Okay, great. That was a little late. Yeah, sorry guys, you
Good one, Chuck.
might have trouble hearing us tonight. We're using old microphones because I didn't bring the new ones back. I know, it's crazy. Anyway, wow, that's loud. Okay.
Yeah, that's pretty loud.
Anyway, tonight we've got with us Dr. Darrell Bock, and Dr. Bock has been on a lot of different prominent shows. He's been on ABC News, BeliefNet.com, ChristianityToday.com. He's been, LA Times has talked about him. He's been on Good Morning America, The O'Reilly Factor, Scarborough Country. He's been everywhere, NPR News. Anyway, Dr. Bock has written a book called The Missing Gospels, unearthing the truth behind alternative Christianities. And what we're going to talk about tonight is we're going to talk about some of these these later found works that I believe is, what is it, Trent? Nag Hammadi, is that the way it's pronounced?
Yeah, the Gnostic Gospels and Nag Hammadi.
Nag Hammadi, okay, yeah. And so that's what we're going to talk about, some of these Gnostic Gospels. We're going to talk about the Da Vinci Code, all these other popular topics that have sprung up recently, and see where they all fit in. So we've got the guy that can tell us all about this here. He is, like I said, world-renowned in his different places here. All the research that's gone into this book is just tremendous. He did this while on a sabbatical. He is actually also a professor of New Testament studies at the Dallas Theological Seminary in Dallas, Texas. So without further ado,
let's bring him on.
Dr. Bock, how are you doing tonight, sir?
I'm doing fine. How are you doing?
We're doing great.
Excellent.
That's good. Is the weather out there decent?
It's not too bad.
75 degrees today.
It was 75 today?
We got the same thing here. If I were a tree, I'd be confused.
Yeah.
It's
not very Christmassy.
Hey,
That's right.
It's prophetic. I'm telling you, it's end times prophecy.
Okay.
Okay. I'm not going to go into that spiel right now.
Global warming.
I'm not going to talk about the global warming either. I do believe in global warming, even though most of the conservatives don't. I have watched Al Gore's new film, and I'm like, okay, I can give this some credence.
I saw an article today that said the snow on the tops of Kilimanjaro, which are mountains on the equator, are melting away.
Yeah, and you look at pictures.
Crazy.
He's got that in his film. You can see pictures of Kilimanjaro like in the 70s with all the snow on the top, and you see it today, and it's just, it looks completely different.
Yeah,
there's not much left.
I know, it's terrible
what would it be without snow?
What's happened to the earth and what's happening. But tonight we're going to talk about your book, and it's let me start out by saying it's a very well written book. It's very well researched. I myself have spent 7 years post high school education. I've got a law degree, unfortunately, and I have an English degree. That's a wonderful thing. Did a lot for me. Let me tell you. No, but I've been there in the I've been there in the research tomes myself, so I know how difficult it is to take all these pieces and put them together. But you're going from it from a whole different level because you're actually getting down into these ancient texts. Now, did you translate a lot of these documents yourself?
No, I don't do a lot of translation work with these extra biblical documents. I was working with the standard translations that do exist of these materials. I have background in the area, but I haven't actually done independent translation.
Okay.
Now, what got you started in this in this area of research with the Gnostic Gospels?
Well, what really happened was that about 3 years ago, I was asked to write a book on the Da Vinci Code, and when I read the Da Vinci Code, I realized that there was the issue related to the novel, and then there was the real issue that the novel was trying to popularize, and that dealing with the novel would not really deal with the substantive New Testament and early church historical issue. And so I said to the publisher as I was finishing the Da Vinci Code book, there really is another book here that desperately needs to be done. It hasn't been written on from a conservative perspective at all, and it needs to be addressed. And so I got the permission to do it and took a sabbatical to get it done.
Now, how long did this take you to complete this work?
That book was basically written within a year.
Okay, that's not bad. That's pretty quick, actually.
Yeah, it is. It's not as fast as the Da Vinci Code book. The Da Vinci Code book took me 5 days.
5 days?
That's correct.
How many pages is that?
It's about 160.
Wow.
I teach the material that's related to the Da Vinci Code. That was just a matter of sitting down and doing it.
Wow. Okay, well, let's start out there. What do you tell people that come to you and ask you about the Da Vinci Code?
Well, I basically say it's a great piece of fiction, but it is purported to be something more than that and to give us a glimpse into early Christian history. And on that point, it's virtually wrong at every level. When I speak in public, I say if Dan Brown were in my classes at the seminary, he'd still be in class.
Now, one thing I noticed about the text that you talk about coming from Nag Hammadi is what you mentioned in your book about the high Christology of all these works, and how they all none of the works from what I've seen really depict Christ as being just a man, but they all depict him as some form of deity. As far as even the ones that don't follow the traditional what are they called, synoptic gospels, the first four.
First three Gospels.
First three, I'm sorry.
Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Okay, but they don't follow those traditional Gospels. A lot of them don't, especially with these ideas of Sophia and all these other just strange things that I had never heard of.
The secret wisdom.
Yeah,
of Christ.
what's going on is that they have a view of a transcendent Jesus. It may not be that he's the second person of the Trinity or anything to that level, but they definitely see Jesus as being a significant transcendent figure who's not just a human being. And there's not a single one of these texts that present Jesus merely as a human figure. As far as I know, the only works that did that were very old Jewish Christian works, Ebionite works, and we've lost those. We don't even have them.
Huh. Now, are you familiar with, and the only reason I mention this is it had been brought to my attention the other week, and we were having an argument with the guy, the Meyer contacts. He was talking about some texts that were found. Where did he say he found those, Trent?
Oh, somewhere, I don't know, somewhere. It was in some kind of little hole in the ground. It was a tomb. It was talking about a tomb that had been used, but there was no body, and under the flagstones of this tomb there were a series of documents.
Well, he claimed that Emmanuel wasn't the same person as Christ, and he had some kind of strange take on this stuff that I had never heard of, and I told him I really couldn't argue it with him because I wasn't aware of the works or where they came from, and he said, well, not many people are, and these were just found and this, that, and the other, and I'm like, well, how do you expect me to argue something like that? But
yeah, I'm not aware of anything like that.
Okay, so same here then. I don't know. Apparently, the guy that found him isn't really talking too much about him. Or he's just talking about him to him.
That's not a good sign.
Definitely not.
I guess just to back up and to give people a little bit of background about the Gnostic Gospels before we go on. Correct me if I'm wrong, but don't a majority of these Gospels refer to the gnosis or special wisdom that Christ has, that's sort of secretive and shared only within the particular tenets of those particular people? Am I right?
Yeah, basically what Christian Gnosticism is a fusion of Christian symbolism with Greco-Roman philosophy, and particularly Neoplatonism. And Platonism believed that spiritual ideas were good and healthy and positive, but all matter was corrupt. Mm-hmm. And so that's what you're getting is this contrast between what's called a dualism, where anything having to do with the spirit is positive, but anything having to do with anything physical, creation, our bodies, etc., is not. And most Christian Gnosticism has this dualism in it that is a part of the core teaching of what's going on. Now, not all extra-biblical Gospels are Gnostic or Christian Gnostic, but all of them have some area where they don't parallel generally what the church was teaching, that is the Orthodox Church. And of course, one of the debates is how far back does Orthodoxy go, and how do we know that it goes back that far? And that was one of the burdens of the book, was to explain that.
And I noticed how you used a lot of the traditional text and dated them at, first century 50 years into, or a lot of the Gnostic texts were dated into the 2nd century, and some even further than that.
That's right, but the dates that I'm using are not debatable in the sense of I'm using the standard dating for those texts that you would find if you picked up the best resources on these Gnostic materials and read their introductions to each one of these works, how they would date the material. Those are the dates that I'm using. So I'm not using preferred conservative dates or anything like that, because in this material there really aren't many preferred conservative dates. There's actually pretty much a consensus that most of this material is 2nd and 3rd century.
Okay. Well, I did find it interesting where you talk about the traditional text, and you excuse me, you talk about the idea of the Greco-Roman resurrection versus the idea of a more of a Jewish traditional resurrection of the entire body instead of just the passing on of the spirit or the soul. And I don't want to use those terms interchangeably. I know that you split those up, and there's definitely a dichotomy there inside your book. But just for layman's purposes, I'll just call it soul or spirit. I found it interesting how you said that these things, the different proofs that you lay out, saying, well, here we have 2 women as the first witnesses to the resurrection, and this is something that was uncommon in that day because men were seen as higher as far as in terms of testimony and testify.
Yeah, a woman couldn't be a witness. So if you're creating a story, why would you create a story to convince a culture of something difficult and then have as your first witnesses people who don't count? That doesn't make sense.
And just the idea, can you explain more about this idea of the bodily resurrection versus the Greco-Roman?
Well, the Greeks either believed that when you died you were dead, that was it, or that if there was some type of afterlife, it only involved the spiritual unseen part of you. So either you went back to like the pleroma, which means that the spiritual part of you, which is kind of pictured as light, goes back to the region of light, or you existed as some kind of an undefined shadow in a shadowy spiritual existence, but they did not believe that you were bodily raised. The bodily resurrection idea comes out of Judaism, and that was something that Christianity inherited from the very beginning. So any teaching that suggested that the resurrection was not a bodily resurrection would automatically be disqualified as being orthodox and going back to Jesus, because the argument was that that Christianity coming out of Judaism would have taken on this bodily resurrection idea. And of course, all our earliest traditions about the resurrection show this as well. So the moment someone teaches a non-bodily resurrection, which is what these Gnostic texts do because they reject the viability of the physical body. The physical body is corrupt, and so it won't be resurrected, neither will the creation. The moment someone rejects that, they've automatically excluded themselves from serious consideration as being a genuine Christian text.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, where did Dan Brown get this idea? I'm sorry, I know I'm flipping from topic to topic.
You
Oh.
yeah,
you are.
That's okay. A stream of consciousness is perfectly fine.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm doing my I'm doing my James Joyce impersonation tonight.
Yeah.
No. But as far as the Da Vinci Code goes, I'm just getting nothing but junk from this guy over here tonight. Anyway, Trent.
I'm not going to go on about your shirt, by the way.
What's wrong with my I'm wearing a Chihuahua t-shirt. Leave me alone. I'm a real man. All right.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Don't get me started on my rants. But, going back to this Da Vinci Code idea, where does Dan Brown get this idea? And I know it's been out there for a long time, especially in the paranormal community, about this bloodline of Christ and all this. Where does this idea originally come from then?
Well, the bloodline of Christ and the idea that he left descendants and that they ended up in the south of France is actually part of a collection of medieval traditions and legends that are associated with the south of France. And the best that we can tell, the furthest back we can date those is somewhere around the 6th century. You know, it's interesting about last April or so, I did a show on NPR with Michael White, who teaches at the University of Texas, who's not at all a theological conservative. And but we did the show together, and he's an expert in the medieval period of church history, and he was waxing eloquent about how recent these traditions are and how they don't have anything to do with Jesus, they don't go back that far, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was a great show. All I did was let him talk because he was right and he knew all the details about it. So these traditions are very, very late, and as such, they don't have a much historical value in really telling us very much about Jesus. But that's what Dan Brown was working with.
Okay. So this were, you said 6th century, so this would be around the time that Islam, the religion of peace, came into the...
well, yeah, just about that time. Be the 500s, a little before.
Okay, fair enough. All right, but it's just so odd because a lot of people want to link this idea of the bloodline of Christ. It seems like in popular press they want to link this idea with the idea of the Gnostic gospel somehow.
Well, that's right, because... again, what you've got is, actually what you have is a real strange fusion. You've got modern ideas. People today want to make Jesus into a human figure primarily. They don't want to hear about his uniqueness. So that's modern. Then you wed it to medieval theories about a bloodline of Jesus, and then you use even more ancient theories of Gnosticism, put it all together, and you've got Dan Brown's stew.
Dan Brown stew. I like that. Did you have a question, Trent?
I'm cooking one up.
Okay. I want to ask you something that's outside of the scope of this book for a second, and that basically dealing with the Apocrypha, dealing with the pseudepigrapha works. How would you... What kind of relevance would you give those as far as why were they thrown out of the canon? Are they good text for Bible-believing Christians? What other kind is there? But are they good text to read supplementally with the New Testament, or what, or the Old Testament?
Yeah, the apocryphal and pseudepigraphical texts really are in a completely different area. The books that we've been talking about up to this point were written after the time of Christ. The apocryphal books and some pseudepigraphical books, and we're talking about Old Testament Apocrypha, Old Testament pseudepigrapha, were written in many of them were written in what we call the intertestamental period, the period between the end of Malachi, around 400, till the time of Christ, 400 BC, till the time of Christ. And they actually fill in historical gaps about what happened to Judaism in this period. And really, to understand what's going on in the New Testament, where the Pharisees and the Sadducees came from, why the Jews had the feeling about Gentiles that they did, etc., these books are actually pretty important in helping us understand what's going on, because in this period was what was called the Maccabean War. This was a war in which people faithful to Judaism fought to preserve their culture against Antiochus Epiphanes, who tried to wipe out Judaism and Jewish practice from 167 to 164 BC. So those books, I tell my students, they're worth reading, not because they're biblical, not because they're canonical, but because they give us an insight into the history of the period and the way Jews were thinking as we get closer and closer to the time of Jesus. The pseudepigraphical works cover some of the same period and then go beyond the time of Christ. They're also Jewish works. There's a mixed bag. Some of them are like apocalyptic works like you get in Revelation. Others of them are wisdom. If you read them, you'd think you were reading a variation of Proverbs. Others of them are different kinds of stories about different aspects of Jewish life and history. And they're of varied value, but they still are a window into at least how some Jewish groups in some Jewish circles are thinking. And so I tell my students that Apocrypha in particular, and pseudepigrapha to a lesser degree, are valuable to us Again, not because they give us perfect theology, but because they are really insightful in understanding the thought and history of the period.
Okay. Would you consider these books to be inspired by God?
No, that's why I'm saying they aren't. Okay. You don't treat them as scripture, but you do treat them as valuable historical sources, just like you might tell someone to read Josephus or Tacitus or Suetonius to understand what Roman life and history was about.
Yeah. Gotcha. Okay. All right. Well, I was wondering. I'd always wondered about that topic. I had a New Testament professor in my college days that used to speak a lot about the apocryphal works and things like that. And I was just, that's an interesting question. You want to run with the Gospel of Thomas, Trent?
Yeah, man, I don't have a question about it.
Oh, okay.
I'm just mentioning the Gospel of Thomas. And
the Gospel of Thomas is the most interesting of these extra-biblical Gospels. Now we're back into the other category again of those works that were written after the time of Christ and that claim to have a connection to something Christian. But what's going on with these materials, with the Gospel of Thomas, is it's basically a collection of 114 sayings of Jesus that are alleged to go back to him. If you read them, it's really interesting. You read about 25% of that material, and you go, boy, this sounds familiar. And the reason it sounds familiar is it's very much like Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. You read another 25% of those 114 sayings, and you go, well, this sounds pretty familiar, and the reason it sounds pretty familiar is it's pretty close to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And then you read the other 50%, and you go, I've never heard that before. Where did that come from? Because it's not at all like Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And what this shows is the Gospel of Thomas has kind of a mixed pedigree. It looks like some of it comes from traditions that were circulating in the church because this period that we're talking about, this is an oral culture, and these are people who are oral in their orientation in terms of how you pass on stories and that kind of thing. And so this oral tradition, some of it apparently comes out of the same stream of tradition that feeds into our biblical materials, but then other parts of it look like they have nothing to do with that tradition at all. And so it's a mixed bag. It's a real eclectic or syncretistic kind of text, but it's fascinating because of the mix that it has. No other text that we have out of these extra biblical sources has that kind of mix in it, and that's why it's gotten so much attention.
Well, Satan uses all kinds of things to cloak, and I don't know. I mean, that's my whole thing. Make it look like the whole idea, and this goes back to some of the things that, when I hung out with John Zaffis and we talked about exorcism in general and Malachi Martin and how the devil likes to cloak everything and kind of spread and just tell one little lie about something, but make everything else look okay, and then boom. Now, I don't know if that's the case with the Gospel of Thomas. I don't know. From what I've seen of it, though, I know a lot of
tools of the devil.
Yeah, well, I know a lot of people have used this to promote these ideas that we're all sons of God, and then they'll take that a step further out of context and say, well, we're all sons of God, and that way we don't need Christ because we're all our own salvation.
Yeah, well, that's something that would immediately be suspect to anyone who came out of the apostolic circle, and this is one of the reasons why Thomas never made it. Origen, speaking in the 300s, talked about which books they don't read in the churches because they aren't recognized as being canonical. They aren't recognized as being authoritative or inspired. He named two Gospels. One of them is the Gospel of Matthias, which we've never seen. It's become lost. And then the other one, interestingly enough, was the Gospel of Thomas.
Wow. All right, well, I'm going to have to stop here. We're going to have to take a quick break. But if you guys want to call in, give us a call here, 877-722-7382, or locally 336-996-1596. And you can speak with Professor Bock or Dr. Bock or Professor Dr. Bock, however you want to call him.
Or just Darrell is fine.
Or just Darrell, all right.
Remember when paranormal radio used to be open to New Age ideas and every possible form of spiritual enlightenment?
It's a religion based on the understanding of consciousness, the understanding of nature, in particular fertility laws.
To my spirit guides are those who have passed over. And, I've always been able to see colors around people, which I've known now to be called auras.
Maybe coming to the close of one kind of psychic life, and I very much believe that this was what the Maya were really trying to talk about.
Well, we're not putting up with that. World of the Unexplained. Conservative paranormal talk. Big on God. Big on Guns with your hosts Jay Scott and Trent Lackey. Heard Mondays live from 8 to 10 Eastern on Planet Paranormal Radio. Every Halloween at midnight, the devil simultaneously appears in two places: the high plains of India and a quiet cemetery in Kansas. It's November 2nd, the Day of the Dead. Two federal marshals report to the small town of Shinbone, Kansas, moments after a tornado warning, to transport a prisoner with no past, no identity. He is known only as Sin Jin Smith. Starring Roddy Piper, Richard Tyson, Jonathan Davis, Kevin Gage, Gary Casper, John Philbin, Billy Duffy, Charles Cyphers, and Eileen Dietz. Check out the movie that critics are calling one of 2007's most anticipated horror films by visiting www.sinjinsmith.com. That's www.sin-jinsmyth.com. St. John Smith is a Snapkick Productions film, written and directed by Ethan Detmeyer. Coming soon to a theater near you.
And you're back to World of the Unexplained.
You're back?
We're back. Yeah, you're talking about the listeners.
Yeah, okay.
Wow. Anyway.
Sorry.
Once again, if you want to talk and call, ask some questions, the numbers are 1-877-SCARE-YOU-2 or 1-877-722-7382. Our local number is 336-996-1596. And also, don't forget to jump in the chat room if you're phone shy and type in your question there.
worldoftheunexplained.com.
Yeah.
And we just, I think, well, no, your friend Paul was in there and he left. I think he's back.
Yeah.
He's asking if you're in the chat room. You know what? I have my laptop, and I brought it with me again tonight. You can get that on the next break if you want.
Right.
I forgot to hook it up.
Yeah.
But yeah, you
I'll
can get in the
this
chat room too that way.
No, we were talking about a little bit about the Gospel of Judas. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure can. It came out with a lot of hype last Easter, and this actually was a gospel that we knew about. A church father named Irenaeus, writing in AD 180, talked about a work that tried to rehabilitate Judas, written by what he called as Cainite Gnostics. This is because this group, at least according to Irenaeus, habitually tried to rehabilitate lots of folks. Cain was the murderer of Abel. He was rehabilitated.
Yeah.
The citizens of Sodom and Gomorrah normally are the bad guys of the Bible. They were rehabilitated. And so Judas is just one of this group. And this gospel actually is more about Gnostic cosmology, that is, how the Gnostics believed the world was created and what came out of that, than anything else. And it actually is a pretty neat little text in that it's only 7 pages long. It doesn't take long to read, and yet it is very, very typical of a Gnostic gospel because of this story of creation, where creation is not the product of the one true God. It's a product of an underling God. It's actually a God 3 levels down from the top. I call him a minor league God. And the creation is corrupt from the beginning. He's responsible for the creation of Adam. There's a huge series of luminaries, because angels were associated with the stars, oftentimes in the ancient world. And so it's a story about how their creation emerged, and that's what much of the material is actually about.
Now, is this other series of gods and the fouled creation? You talk about the archons. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
That's exactly right.
What are these archons? Or are they? I don't understand. Trent, you may know more about it.
The Greek word for ruler is the word archon, and so that's what an archon is. These would be spiritual rulers, so they would be helpers of the God, helping to run the universe. One of the books found at Nag Hammadi has the best title out of all these extra-biblical gospels, and that title is Hypostasis of the Archons. In fact, I joke with my students, you can't pronounce that normally. It should be Hypostasis of the Archon.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it really is a great name. It means the reality of the rulers. It'll be a movie title someday.
It sounds exactly like a movie title.
Probably become a video game. And
we need the echo effect after you say it.
That's exactly right. It's really, but it's a story about how these spiritual rulers were created. It's another Gnostic text. both Judas and this hypostasis of the archons, for that matter, are second-century texts. And again, they don't tell us anything about the real Judas. They don't tell us anything about the real Jesus, but they are an attempt to drive a wedge between Orthodox Christianity and the connections to Jesus by suggesting that the apostles, that some of the apostles had special knowledge. In the Gospel of Judas, the one who has the special knowledge is Judas, that none of the other gospel writers or none of the other apostles have. And so in attributing this special knowledge to him in this special role, even though he's going to end up being criticized for betraying Jesus, the Gospel of Judas says that Jesus told him to betray him, and so it's rehabilitating Judas for simply doing the will of God.
Now,
that's a pretty common argument.
Well, yeah, we know in the New Testament, though, it talks about Judas, basically being demonically possessed, or there's a reference. I don't remember the reference off the top of my head.
Yes, in Luke chapter 22.
See, there we go. Ask a Bible scholar; he can tell you. You can probably quote that section for us, can't you?
Well, it basically says that Satan entered into Judas, and then it talks about him going on and betraying him.
Yeah. Okay, there we go.
Simple as that.
But
that Judas is performing the will of God by betraying Christ.
Yeah. I mean, that actually is one element of a strand of what the Bible says, but it also goes on to say, "Woe to him through whom the Son of Man is betrayed." So that's not exactly an affirmation.
Yeah.
Now, what is your take on that from a spiritual point of view, from a Christian point of view? What is your take on Judas? Was he demonically possessed? Did he open himself up to this possession?
That's what the text not only says that he was demonically possessed, that would be Luke, but in John he's described as a son of the devil, which basically means he follows in the way of the devil. So he's not endorsed in a positive way at all by the biblical text.
I mean, as far as something that I'm going to have to collect my thoughts on that. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to come back to that. I'm trying to get at something that I don't know how to quite phrase. I know you're looking at me. I'm always know how to phrase it.
Are you wrestling with the tension between how this can be a part of the will of God and yet Judas be held responsible for it? Is that kind of where you're going?
To a degree, but I mean, and obviously,
it's the will of God, but then again, the devil's involved in
with the whole concept of free will.
And
how that plays into things. Is it something that are we to assume because he was demonically possessed that the free will that he chose, hey, I'm going to betray Christ,
wasn't there?
Or are we to assume
part of what you end up being held responsible for in Scripture is giving Satan a place to come in?
Yeah, allowing that opening.
Exactly.
Okay. Now Judas. Now I'm trying to remember correctly. I believe Judas killed himself in Potter's Field. Is that correct?
That's right. He killed himself, and this is another indication of his status because he did engage in suicide. That's obviously a kind of ending that, at least in biblical terms, is often associated with people who have fallen way out of the will of God.
Okay. Now let me bring up something else that has nothing to do with what we're talking about as far as your book's concerned, but it's a question that I've had before. And I don't know exactly where this came from. It may have came from the Catholics. They make up all kinds of things. No offense, John and my other Catholic listeners. But no, I like Catholicism. They're good people. I was an Episcopalian at one time. It's all the fun of Catholicism without the guilt. But going back to... I know Trent's looking at me now. Going back to this whole idea, I don't know where it comes from. Well, like purgatory, things like that. That's what I'm talking about. But going back to the idea of where the devil... The devil did not want to worship. This is going back to the fall of Satan. God told Satan to worship the human being, and Satan refused to do this.
Humans are inferior.
Yeah, that is in a pseudepigraphical work.
Okay, that's where it came from.
The Life of Adam and Eve.
All right.
It basically is an explanation for why Satan tempted Adam and Eve. And the explanation is that God made man in his image. He didn't make the angels in his image, and basically gave man a place of honor that was greater than that which the angels and Satan had, and Satan was jealous. And so out of this jealousy, he became motivated to try and get humanity off track. So it's filling in a gap, something the Bible doesn't tell us, and fills in this gap with information that fills the gap. I mean, it doesn't come from anywhere. There's no explanation for where it came from. And on the basis of that, then, that story emerged.
Okay, well, I knew it wasn't out of the traditional text because I had remembered someone asking me about that before, and I'm like, that's not in the Bible. And I did some research. It was your wife that asked me about that, Trent, actually, I think.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot.
And I was like, I know it came from somewhere, and I went looking for it, and I can't remember what I'd come up with, but I was like, it's definitely not in the traditional, in the Bible that I read.
Did y'all talk about that because it was you all trying to decide whose fault it was, Adam or Eve, so that you knew who to blame, or what was the deal?
I blame Eve. I know it's the woman's fault.
Oh, my gosh.
I'm kidding. All right, we've got a caller real quick.
Yeah, well, I figured that would generate a call.
Exactly. That was too quick. Caller, you're on the air. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hey, this is Paul.
Hey,
Hey, Paul. Paul's in the chat room.
From GB.
How you doing?
We're doing good. What's your question for Dr. Bock?
I've got a question about, I think it was the Council of Nicaea, where the canonical books of the Bible, were decided upon. And I was wondering if he could talk about that for just a little bit and how the bishops and the people involved in the council came to the decision they did as to, what books were going to go in and what books were going to be kept out.
And let me work through your question because it actually has several elements to it. And this is one of these Brownisms. It's part of the Brown stew, which is why he needs to come to seminary. At the Council of Nicaea, the biblical books were not discussed at all. There was no decision made on biblical books at the Council of Nicaea. What the Council of Nicaea did was to write a creed that tried to define what the core of Christianity was in very technical and philosophical language so that people could understand basically the doctrine of God, particularly the relationship between the Father and the Son. And at Nicaea, which took place in AD 325, so we're just after the time when Constantine comes to the head of the Roman Empire and becomes a Christian and makes Christianity a recognized religion so that it's no longer persecuted. He called together the bishops at Nicaea because there was some discussion on this theology, and he did want a unified church for the sake of the empire. And they discussed this question, and that was basically, in what sense was Jesus the Son of God? And there were two views. One was what was called Arianism, which basically argued that Jesus was the first created being who God elevated to the Son of God status. And the other is that Jesus was the Son of God eternally from the very, very beginning. There was no moment when he wasn't the Son of God. Arius taught that there was a time when the Son of God was not. Now, notice that in both of these views, this is very important, in both of these views, Jesus is a transcendent figure. Okay? It's not the idea of being elevated from being a human to being the Son of God. It's the idea of being elevated from being a spiritual being, a created spiritual being, to being the Son of God. But the view that was adopted at Nicaea and was approved was the view that Jesus was eternally the Son of God, and that we know the vote at that conference. What happened at the end is that the bishops were asked to sign the creed that was written. That was the only vote that was taken, and it wasn't a CNN hanging Chad vote where you were told you can wake up in the morning and find out who won. It wasn't that close. All but two of the bishops who attended that conference signed that creed. We don't know the exact number of the bishops attending. It's somewhere between 216 and 316, but that means that vote was somewhere between 214 to 2 to 314 to 2. Now, most politicians, if they won an election with a 99% majority, would be pretty happy. And so this wasn't close. Now, the issue was discussed in the church for much of the rest of that century in particular, because there were some followers of Arius who were pretty successful in promoting their views and in having some success. And this is one of the reasons Constantine called the Council of Nicaea. So that's the Council of Nicaea. The second part of the question is really, well, then where did the recognition of the books come from? And I'm using the word recognition on purpose. The church did not choose the books of the New Testament. What the church did is they came along and they asked, which books are the churches across the regions using, and which books are functioning as the Word of God in the church? And they recognized what books these were. And basically the standards that they used were, did they go back to the earliest generation? Were they a reflection of Orthodox theology? And how widespread was their use? Were they being used in a widespread regions of the church as opposed to being, in a church here and there? And that process, the best we can tell, started in the middle to the end of the 2nd century. By the end of the 2nd century, the 4 Gospels, Acts, and the Epistles of Paul were all recognized. What was debated in the remaining time, Dan Brown talks about the fact that the discussion of the canon goes into the 4th century, technically correct. But what was being discussed in that remaining 2 centuries were the little books like 2 John, 3 John, Jude, Philemon. Hebrews was discussed because it was debated whether it went back to Paul or not. Revelation was discussed because it was so different than everything else.
Right.
And basically everything else was recognized. There were some books that ended up in the collection of what's called the Apostolic Fathers. Those are the writings of the generation after the apostles and their immediate followers. And some of those books were initially seen as possibly being inspired. 3 books in particular, for what's called First Clement, what's called the Didache, and what's called the Shepherd of Hermas. Those 3 were discussed originally as possibly being inspired, but in the end they didn't make it.
Does that answer your question, Paul?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Anything else, or?
No. A lot of that
I know it takes a while to go through.
I think that the phrase that was used a lot of the times about which books were going to be recognized and which weren't was ones that were used everywhere.
Yeah, the
every
phrase
time,
that
something like that.
Associated with that is the phrase Catholicity.
Right.
And the term Catholic basically means universal.
Right.
And we're not talking Roman Catholic here. We're just talking about the word Catholic, and that means universal. So the standard was Catholicity, which basically means, was the usage widespread? Was it showing evidence that the church all across the board was responding to and was using this material? And that was one of the evidences that was used, was how widespread the use of the book was.
Wow. Word etymology. We're learning things tonight.
Yes.
Actually, I knew that word. It's that whole English major thing. I've got a bunch of big college words under my belt. I'm an English snob. That's right. Thank you for calling in, Paul.
Oh, you're welcome.
We'll see you in
take care of
chat.
yourself, all right?
All right.
All right.
Bye.
Bye. All right, that number again is 877-722-7382. Call and speak with Dr. Bock if you're numerically impaired or numerically challenged to be politically correct, and we never do that on this show. But if you are numerically impaired, you can call us here at 877-SCARE-U2. That's 877-SCARE-U2 or locally 336-996-1596. We've got about 8 minutes before the top of the hour.
That's really... Yeah, the Arianism was so huge. I mean, honestly, from what I remember, it was so widespread and so rampant that they had to put some kind of a stop to it.
Yeah, they were worried about the impact of it because they did feel like it seriously impaired the teaching of who Jesus was and gave a much more restricted view of who he was.
Mm-hmm. That's true. I mean, I want to say one of their arguments was, I'm really just going off somewhere here, but
that's okay.
Basically, from what I remember, when Jesus was on the cross and he said, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" was one of their big lines. That if Jesus were one and the same with God the Father, then why would he speak to God as like a separate person?
Well, Jesus praised to God in the Garden of Gethsemane.
There are a series of texts that they appeal to. That was one of them. Another one that they like to appeal to was the passage where Jesus says, they're discussing the time of the return. Mm-hmm. And he says, and no one knows the time except the Father. That's in Mark.
Right.
And so that's another passage that was often brought forward for making the argument that Jesus had limited knowledge and therefore couldn't be divine, etc.
No, a lot of people argue, and this is an argument I've heard before, that Christ didn't said that because he didn't, the argument I've heard is he didn't know at the time, but once he had ascended, he went and came back as one with the Father, even though he was one the whole time. I don't know, this is getting way too mind-boggling for me, but the idea being that now he knows the time.
Well, I think perhaps a better explanation is, what the church has said is that Jesus's two natures were always together, but that there were times when he would choose not to draw upon the divine side of who he was. And that's probably a better way to go at the passage than to suggest that he didn't know and that he discovered it at some point later.
Now,
that would seem to make a little more sense.
This seems like a good segue into part of your book where you talk about some of the Gnostic Gospels, speaking of Jesus as not suffering, speaking of it being a separate figure, a separate person that suffers, why he himself is so deific that he's just kind of removing himself from that suffering. And some of the Gnostic Gospels have been proponents of that argument. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, for example, in the Apocalypse of Peter, there's a passage where Jesus is laughing, and
that's the one that came to memory.
Peter has.
Yeah.
And Peter asks him about it. So what's this laughing Jesus? What's going on here? And he explains that of course, they're laughing while the crucifixion is going on. So Jesus explains that the vision is that he, in effect, has departed from the body that he was occupying, and that it is the substitute that's gone on the cross, and he himself actually never suffered on the cross. And the reason why he's laughing is, in effect, he's faked out all these people who think that they've crucified him when they haven't touched him at all.
Yeah.
Now, that's obviously a very different view of the crucifixion than you normally hear in Christian circles.
That's heretical.
Would be something that would immediately have been suspect to people who had any awareness at all of what it was the church taught about Jesus' death.
That's definitely something the church would consider heretical.
Yeah,
exactly right.
Completely.
They wouldn't even have to pause and think about it. I mean, there wouldn't be upon further review. Okay, you'd get it the first time.
It's like, no.
I think a lot of Christians struggle with that idea, though, because Christ, yes, he was human, but did he suffer the same way that we suffer as human beings? Because he was part God, and
I think part of the answer to that question is that in some ways you could argue he suffered more. Not only do you have the scene in Gethsemane, which makes clear that he's coming to grips with the suffering, but the suffering that he undergoes is a substitutionary suffering. It's not for something that he's done. It's if you want to think of it this way, it's an unjust kind of suffering. So he didn't even have to go through it. Sometimes when we go through suffering, it isn't always the case, but sometimes when we go through suffering, we get what we pay for.
Oh yeah.
But that's not the case with him, and so and in that sense, he knew and felt the pain of the suffering, the separation of the suffering, etc., in a way that, generally speaking, we're not as sensitive to.
Now, we've only got about 3 minutes before the top of the hour. I do want to mention this because I saw it last night. The Nativity story. Have you guys? Are you familiar with this, guys? Yeah, it just came out.
Actually, I read the script before it went to film.
Really?
Oh. Yes.
Huh. Now I didn't know. I was going to check it out. I'm in the Old Testament right now, and I tend to stay in the Old Testament. I don't know. I like the wrathful God.
Well, no, Jesus, come on now.
But I do tend to stay in the Old Testament a lot. I have been for the past couple months. I'll kind of jump into Acts sometimes, but I have been staying in the Old Testament because I'm reading it straight through. And right now I'm in 2 Kings. But I was like, oh man, something doesn't sit right with me about one part of the film where a couple of things didn't sit right with me, and I didn't know if they were biblically accurate or if they were just Hollywood licensed. Well, one of those parts being how Mary was kind of forced into the arranged marriage with Joseph.
That actually would have been likely the case. That the marriage would have been something her family would have arranged.
Yeah, historically speaking, yeah, but I don't think we're never told that, though, are we?
Huh?
We're never told that in the traditional text.
No, but that would generally be the way it would happen. The marriage would likely have been arranged by the father.
Okay, and the other thing
is...
It's
sort of a cultural thing, too.
Yeah, and like I said, the other thing I don't know, I haven't gone to the text because I watched this really late last night, but the other thing would be the fact that when the angel came to Joseph, it came to him in a dream. Now, I think the Bible tells us that it came to him at night, and it doesn't... I mean, obviously, you could interpret that as being a dream, and I'm not sure. Like I said, I would have to check the text. Do you know?
No, actually, again, that's Matthew. Matthew has 4 important dreams in the infancy material.
Okay.
And the explanation to Joseph is one of them.
Okay, so basically the film, from what I saw, everything else seemed to me to be biblically
Yeah, the one part
correct.
that was a little bit problematic is the idea of the Magi being there at the same time as the shepherds. That probably didn't happen because the Magi would have gotten there probably later. The shepherds would have been there that night, but the Magi would have gotten there a little later.
Okay.
Right.
Well, there we go.
They have to see the star and come all the way from
Exactly.
where they come from.
It's really a good movie, guys. You should check it out.
Very well done.
Oh, it is.
Yeah, and what I really liked about it was it really gives a taste of what life in the first century would have been like. They've been very careful to get.
And we're back on World of the Unexplained. Dr. Darrell Bock is with us tonight. The numbers here are 877-722-7382. That's 877-SCARE-YOU2. Or locally 336-996-1596. Now, you can buy Dr. Bock's book on Amazon.com. I think, is that the best place to get it, Dr. Bock?
Well, if you want it sent to you and you don't want to go for it, that's the easiest way. You can find it probably in just about any bookstore around the country. Borders, Barnes & Noble, Christian bookstores, just about everybody carries it. But if you want it sent to you, Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com will get it to you.
Okay, and the title of the book is The Missing Gospels, Unearthing the Truth.
Unearthing the Truth about Alternative Christianities.
And it's now we've got a link on our website as well. So you can click on the guests button there at worldoftheunexplained.com, and it'll take you right to a picture of Darrell and a picture of his book, and you can click on there and you can get to your website. What is your website again?
Well, I do a blog on a website that's real simple to remember. It's www.bible.org. And there's all kinds of materials there related to the Bible and biblical study and Christian theology, etc. But they've asked me to do a blog, and I get on there about 2 or 3 times a week and just talk about whatever I want to blog on. And so, like last week, we were blogging on some of the Christmas specials because I had done a show for CNN and a show on 2020, and so telling people that was coming up. So, and then I, will ask for responses. So I've asked for people's impressions of the movie The Nativity and that kind of thing.
It was like I said, it was a great book. Book. It was a great movie, and you have a great book. There we go. That's better, right?
Buy it right now. And
exactly.
Actually, it really is a great.
It is a great book for Christmas. It really is because
I think it is for the people on your list who have.
Well, especially for Christians that have a hard time, because a lot of these people are going to throw stuff in your path, and you're not going to be able to defend the gospel. A lot of times, like if you're like me, that I've heard all this stuff, and I'm like, well, I know it's wrong, but I don't know why.
Yeah, exactly. I call them conversation stoppers. You start into a conversation, and someone says to you, well, what about the Council of Nicaea? Or what about those books that never made it in the Bible that should have? Or what about, all those other Gospels that are written about Jesus? Now, you can take it in whatever form you want, and it stops the conversation because most people's knowledge of church history, I like to summarize, goes something like this. They know that Jesus and the apostles were in the 1st century, and then they wave to Augustine somewhere in the medieval period. They say hello to Luther and Calvin, and then there's Billy Graham. That leaves a lot of gaps. And Dan Brown came in and filled in one of these gaps with information he said was carefully researched and told you, what the history of the early church was and did it in an engaging kind of way. But unfortunately, virtually everything that he said wasn't so.
Now, have you seen the movie or read the book, The Da Vinci Code?
Oh yeah. I've read the book and I've seen the movie a couple of times. I've even seen the movie in Russian.
Oh wow! Do you speak Russision?
I actually spoke on this in Germany, and the congregation that was involved was a mixture of Russians and Germans. So they showed the movie in Russian first, and then I spoke and was translated into German. So
now, do you speak any Russian at all?
I don't speak any Russian at all, but I'll tell you, it was an entertaining movie in Russian.
I bet so.
Well, Trent made about as much sense in Russian as it does in English.
Yeah, that's true.
Trent speaks fluent Russian, and
I wouldn't say fluent, but I mean, it definitely would be interesting for me to watch that.
Yeah, my daughter took Russian at university too.
Oh, really?
Wow,
cool.
Yeah,
very cool.
No, I want to bring up the Seth idea this idea of this confused me a little bit when I was reading, and I confess I read. I'm usually up until 3 or 4 every morning. I have a very strange schedule. So I read a lot at night when there's nothing going on.
We're doing morning radio, is that right?
That's well, that's the great thing. I get up around 12 and start my business day. I know it's terrible, but it's true. I confess. So I'm usually up until about 3 or 4 in the morning reading. And the one thing that I was coming across when I was reading, and it was late, like I said, I was a little tired. I think I put the book down around that time, but one of the things I read one of the nights, it talked about Seth, and I think I was trying to understand it, and I was like, well, I just can't think. You know how it is, you read something over and over again, and it's like, okay, this sentence just didn't make sense to me, and I read it 5 times, and so you put it down, you're like, I'm definitely way too tired to continue. So, yeah, it's one of those, and it's late, so I put it down.
And the writer was bad.
No, definitely not. But, the idea of Jesus coming into Seth's body, am I hitting on this right?
Yeah, there is a strand of Christian Gnosticism that is called Sethian Gnosticism.
Okay.
And the idea really is that Jesus is really Seth resent to earth, if you will. And there are variations like this. If anything unusual happens to a particular biblical figure, then sometimes that figure has shown up in the pseudepigraphical works of Judaism in an unusual way. For example, Enoch, was taken from the earth according to Genesis 5. So the next question is, that inquiring minds want to know, is what happened to Enoch?
Yeah.
Well, that's what the book of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Enoch are about. They are explanations, different explanations about how that worked. And the explanation of 1st Enoch is that God showed him what was going on in heaven, showed him the plan, and is going to send him back as the Son of Man.
Wow.
So that's why he didn't die, because he was coming back again to be the Son of Man and exercise judgment in the end.
No, I want an explanation, but I know a lot of people listening probably do, and I don't remember the explanation I got years ago. But there's so many references to Son of Man in the Bible when they refer to Christ. Now,
yeah, it's Jesus' favorite name for himself. It's the name he preferred to call himself.
Now, what does that mean? Is he referring to the lineage through David, or how is that?
It's a great question. He's actually the reason it's such a good name for him is because it really represents a fusion between a human element and a divine authority element. And basically, it works like this: the phrase is actually rooted in Aramaic and comes out of the book of Daniel. And a son of man is simply a way of saying a descendant of a human being. Okay? If I were to say son of David, that would mean David's son. If I were to say Jay's son or son of Jay, that would be your son. So the idiom simply means the son or the descendant of the person to whom the son's connected. So son of man is simply a man's son. That's the human side. But what's interesting in Daniel is that this Son of Man figure, this human figure, who's in contrast to all kinds of strange conglomerate animals in Daniel 7 that represent various kingships, this human being rides the clouds. Well, the only people who ride the clouds in the Old Testament are either God himself or descriptions of foreign gods. It's a category of deity. And so this Son of Man, this human being, rides the clouds, and he comes to the Ancient of Days, which is a reference to the God of Israel. And the Ancient of Days gives him judgment authority. So he shares authority with God. So this title is this wonderful mix of humanity and divinity that actually is a wonderful summation of how Jesus presented himself.
Okay, that's a good answer.
Yeah, very.
Now, I've got to bring something up on a lighter note. Chuck pulled up Star Trek, The Return of the Archons, 1967. Is this an episode, Chuck?
They're getting there. All they need is hypostasis, and they've got it,
Of the Archons. Apocalyptistasis.
No, they didn't quite get the first half of the title, so our idea is still out there if someone wants to pick it up.
All you burgeoning movie makers out there.
Write to me, Billy Graham. No, just kidding.
Now, were you in that class with me, Chuck, in college? We did the Greek history class. Were you in that?
No, I wasn't. I think Dean was in that.
Yeah, Dean was in that with me. Yeah, I did a paper on death, and I had a book on Greek death and dying. I did a paper and linked it to all these ancient text. It was really, yeah. Oh, well, anyway, never mind.
That sounds kind of cool. Yeah.
It was
because once you're done, you're done.
Yep.
That's
when you punch the clock stops.
Yeah, it was kosher.
Yeah.
Yeah, with an Ivy League
You're in
education.
some kind of gloomy place.
That's right, an
with all
Ivy League
eternity.
education, man. Where did you go to school at?
Might be a Yale.
Princeton or Yale? It's one of the, yeah, well, anyway. Kircher, he's a good teacher, good professor. Anyway, there was somewhere else I was going, and now I can't. Oh, I know where I was going. And this is something I've been burning to ask. Do you know now? Do you, as a scholar and as a professor, I'm assuming at seminary you had to learn. Now I don't know how much of it you've used. Now I know my uncle is a Baptist minister. He went to seminary and he doesn't remember half of what he learned about ancient Hebrew. But as a professor, do you use ancient Hebrew, ancient Greek, Aramaic, any of this stuff?
We at our seminary, every student is required to do 2.5 years of Greek and a year and a half of Hebrew. And when I went to school, it was 3 years of Greek and 2 years of Hebrew.
Now, do you still use yours?
Anyway, and so I continue to use my language as I work. I mean, I teach in the New Testament department, so I'm using Greek on a regular basis, all year round. I don't use Hebrew that much, but I can work with it.
Okay, and the question...
I also took Aramaic when I was at seminary because portions of the Old Testament are in Aramaic, and actually the language that Jesus spoke
was Aramaic,
would have been Aramaic as well.
Now, the reason I bring this up is because there's a guy on the radio. His name's Kevin Smith. He does a show called The Kevin Smith Show. Now, I've got to get him on here. I've already called him a heretic over the phone. We had a conversation. Late one night, I gave him the Michael Savage approach, if you guys are familiar with what that is. But I bullied him, and he stopped talking for a little bit. And then I didn't think he wanted to continue the conversation, but he did. And so we continued the conversation until about 4 a.m. But he's got a book out called Gods in the Garden, and I read part of it because he's arguing that Genesis is... he argues a lot of things in Genesis, and one of the things that he uses to attack the book... Oh, yeah. You remember who I'm talking...
Yeah, I remember this. Go ahead.
It's like... Elohim, he's saying the I am ending on it is plural, and it says the gods created the world. And, I guess from a biblical seminary perspective, you're taught that that's the Trinity. But he goes through and he uses this thing, and he uses these ideas saying that we're all gods and we're all this and that and the other, and that's kind of where he's coming from. And being that I didn't know any Hebrew or Greek or anything like this, I had no...
Didn't really argue it.
All I could do was make fun of him, which I did pretty well. So we're going to have him on the show to bash him some more.
Yeah.
So if you're listening, Kevin Smith, your time is coming. Anyway, but what do you have to say in regards to something like that?
It's actually what's called an intensive plural in Hebrew. It is plural, but it's a way of referring to God in a kind of majestic kind of way, and that's probably linguistically all that's going on. So it isn't gods. That idea is. That idea isn't there, because everything about what's written in the Hebrew Bible is about the fact that God, there is only one God. Yeah. And, that's at the core of the law of the books that are being written at the start of the Bible. So Deuteronomy 6:4 is a passage which was repeated in the synagogue week after week, that basically begins, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God." And then, of course, the first commandment, you shouldn't have any other gods before me. So,
well, a lot of people use that argument and say, well, then obviously there are other gods, because it says right there, you should have no other gods before me.
Yeah,
well, that's because people are working in a world in which there's a belief about other gods, and they're worshiping other gods, but that doesn't necessarily make those gods real gods.
I need to have you come on the show and smite him sometime, Darrell. I'll get you a copy of that book out.
Well, I leave all my smiting equipment in my office.
Oh, okay. I'll have to send him down to Texas.
Okay.
We know how you boys take care of things in the South, just like we do.
Yeah. You can also send him to the Northeast. I hear there's a guy named Guido who's pretty good.
Yeah.
Oh, Lord. Oh, man. Well, we could go on. I've got all kinds of topics, but let me make an announcement real quick, so you guys know that you're listening now. We're holding a conference on June the 9th, 2007 in Greensboro, North Carolina. and we're going to have me there. I know you guys are really thrilled about that. I'm going to be there talking about my new book, The Great Deception. We're also going to have John Zaffis there talking about his book, Shadows in the Dark. He's going to speak about possession and exorcism and some of the ministers that he's worked with in his lifetime. You'll know John. If you don't know John, you've been under a rock for a while if you're into paranormal. But John's always on TV, and John's a great guy. We're also going to have Bill Schneblin there, the ex-vampire himself, now born-again Christian. You should check his story out. It's somewhat different, with oneaccord.org. That's his site. We're also going to have author Terry Bain, Actual Factual Dracula, and she's examining the historical descriptions of vampires throughout the ages in a neat little compendium. If you read her book, you'll notice that she graced me with a blurb. I'm so happy. My first blurb on the book, hey? Come on, Trent, give me some kudos here.
No, man, you didn't even mention us.
He's mad that I didn't mention it. It says the show name on there.
Yeah.
She asked me. I didn't ask her. She asked me. She wrote me and asked me.
Scott. I'm talking about the
I'm not
convention.
done yet. I'm going through it.
No. It's too late.
Wotu's going to be there. I'm going to be there. Chuck's going to be there. Well, it's because I'm doing the presenting.
Comrade, you know?
I'm doing the presenting on my book. That's why. Well, anyway, but Trent is going to be there, and you can meet him. Chuck, our producer, is going to be there, and you can meet him as well. And I think Laura from Full Moon's going to show up, too.
Oh, really?
So that'll be nice.
Yeah,
now, we all know she's a pagan, but that's okay. She's a nice lady.
Yes.
All right, and then who else do we have? Dr. Al Prophet's going to be there. He's teaching now at Appalachian State University. He was teaching at Western, but he's going to be there as well, talking about showing some of those videos, amazing videos of ghost footage that he took. And who else is going to be there? Am I leaving anybody out? Well, anyway, the tickets are only $50. And you guys, I'm going to set up a website pretty soon where you can purchase. We have to sell 25 of these pre-sales or else we're calling it off. But I want everybody to know that the tickets are going to be $50. And we're also going to have a VIP available to where you can actually come out and have dinner with us after the event. And that's going to be a little bit more, but you can schmooze with everybody and get to know everybody, have a nice dinner and all that. I just wanted to bring that in and let you guys know about it.
The announcement has been made.
The announcement has been made. Back to you, Dr. Bock. We've got 6 minutes until our next break, and I know if you need water or anything like that and need to take a break, we're definitely going to let you do that. I know it's hard sometimes staying on for 2 hours.
Well, I'm enjoying myself. I'm having a great time.
Well, good. We're having a great time too, and you're a very interesting guest. One of the I was really excited when we got you, and I told Trent about it because I'd had who was it? We were doing a show.
I was really excited about.
We were doing a show, and somebody mentioned the Gospel of Thomas, and I was like, I don't know, and I was looking it up on the internet.
Stuff that, definitely, this is an area of the unexplained, so to speak, that we have not covered at all.
I know.
I don't think we've done it justice.
Tell us about the Nag. Tell us about this Nag Hammadi thing.
Yeah.
Now, where did these things come from? Who found them? When were they found?
It's a great question. Well, in 1945, there was a guy named Muhammad Ali, believe it or not.
You are kidding me.
Roaming the desert. Okay, it's obviously not the boxer, but it has the same name.
In Egypt.
Oh yeah.
And he came across this vase, basically a pottery, and looked in it and realized there was something in it. Cracked it open and. Lo and behold, what he had found is what became known as the Nag Hammadi Library. It was 52 extra biblical books that someone had hid away because the threat was that they would be burned or disposed of. And obviously this person wanted to preserve them and put them in a location where he knew where they were and no one else did. And Muhammad Ali stumbled over it and he recognized that it was something significant, but he didn't know what it was, and eventually worked its way through various what we call antiquities dealers, and got to the point where it was brought, I think, to the University of Cairo. And when it made it to the University of Cairo, because these texts are in Coptic, which is it's Egyptian in Greek letters, they knew the language and recognized what it was that they were dealing with, and then the process of study began, and basically critical texts were put together. That took from the 40s really into the 70s, and then popular books about this material started to surface about the end of the 70s. Elaine Pagels, who teaches at Princeton, wrote a book called The Gnostic Gospels, real favorable towards this material. She's one of the ones who's driven this theory about about this requiring a rewrite of early Christian history and that kind of thing, because history is written by the winners.
Yeah, you mentioned Pagels a lot in your book.
So she wrote published a book called The Gnostic Gospels, which was the first attempt to explain these finds to a popular audience. And then really since then there have been books coming out, literally a dozen a year almost, dealing with one aspect or another of the lost books of the Bible, the hidden books of the Bible, or a translation of a particular gospel, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, etc., all dealing with different aspects of this material.
Okay. Now, yeah, you mentioned Pagels a lot in your book, where you talk about some of the things that she said, and you also mentioned Ed
Yamauchi.
Yeah, now he's who you worked with there while you were on your sabbatical in Germany, or
actually, he is he's a professor. He's just retired. He's a professor of history at the University of Miami in Ohio, who had done a lot of work in this material in the 70s and 80s. Okay. And so he actually is a friend. We both work in New Testament. Our expertise overlaps in New Testament. We're a member of certain societies together. So he has written a blurb for the book for me and was very interested in my project from the very beginning. And so he's kind of walked with me through it as I was writing the book. Okay. Now, the man that I worked with is a man named Martin Hengel, who's probably one of the best-known New Testament professors in the world and is an expert on really the historical backgrounds to the New Testament.
Oh, now what do you find is the most? What I know a lot of. So I've only got a couple minutes before our break, but I'll try to make this short. I know a lot of the things showing up in seminaries today concern me, and that's just in general. I know that a lot of people that attend seminaries don't have that belief that probably when you went to seminary people have. A lot of people don't even believe in Christ as being a son of God,
or in the devil.
Yeah, or in the devil is a real entity. And that kind of scares me that we're setting these people up to go out into the world.
Well, the teaching of Christianity really is split into three wings, if I can say it that way. This is a gross oversimplification, but I'll do it. Okay. And that is, you've got the teaching that goes on in the universities, and most university professors who handle the history and theology of Christianity do so from a very either secular point of view or a very skeptical point of view. Yeah. Then you've got your mainline denominations, and many of them are also not conservatively oriented as well, because a lot of people who are teaching those classes have been taught in the universities and university religion programs. Yeah. And then you've got your more conservative seminaries, and those conservative seminaries might be Catholic or Protestant, but and actually the bulk of seminary students are actually going to the conservative schools, but there are a lot of people who teach particularly in mainline churches who can be all over the map because they've gotten their training either at a seminary where people have been university trained who have taught them, or they've gotten the bulk of their training in a university setting.
Okay. Well, it's a scary time. That's all I'm saying. Mm-hmm. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back with Dr. Darrell Bock. Give us a call, 877-SCARE-U2. We'll be back on World of the Unexplained.
And we're back to World of the Unexplained. The numbers are 1-877-722-7382, 1-877-SCARE-U2. The local number is 336-996-1596. Come on, guys, don't be shy.
But let's get back into the winners rewriting history. We talked about that on the break. Can you
elaborate?
Thank you. That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's said by the group that wants to see a rewriting of early Christian history is that history is written by the winners. And now that we found the writing of the losers, those who've been suppressed, that history needs to be tweaked. And there is an element of truth to that a lot of history is written by people, and the most circulated forms of the history are written by people who are the winners. I mean, just look at how our accounts of World War II come down to us. There aren't too many of the Nazis left to write their perspective on things.
Oh, man.
So, I mean, that sometimes does happen. But the other half of what I call it a mantra, because it gets repeated over and over and over again as if it's true without any reflection. But in fact, in some cases, it's the case that losers do get to write and do get to present their material, And the early church in the first 3 centuries before Constantine was definitely not in a position of power. It was being persecuted. Its theology was developed in a context of being a people of suffering. So you're not dealing with losers in that technical sense in this early period when the theology of the church is being developed. But more importantly is this, and that is that sometimes the winners win for good reason. In other words, history may be written by the winners, but sometimes the winners deserved to win. And in this particular case, with the development of early Christianity, the reason you have the bulk of the material reflecting Orthodox theology is because it has the best pedigree. It has the best genealogy of going all the way back to Jesus and the times of Jesus and to the life and teaching of Jesus, much better than anything else that people are trying to put in its place. And so for that reason, it should be embraced and respected and given the position of, if you will, historical privilege that it's had, because it actually is a reflection of what the earliest generation of Christians thought and taught.
All right. Well,
well put.
That is very concise. Now, I want to also, we talked earlier, kind of off center a little bit about some of the things that happened and why would anybody believe this story of this guy claiming to be the Son of God and rising from the dead? Why would how a lot of people say, that's just a made up story. Well, what elements? I know we talked about, the witnesses being women. Let's talk about some of these things that would lend that to being a story that wasn't made up.
Well, another element of this equation, interestingly enough, is the very fact of a bodily resurrection. What Jesus' teaching indicates, or what the ministry and life and ministry of Jesus indicates, of course, is that he was resurrected in the midst of history. Now, let me tell you why that's important. That's important because if a Jewish person were writing a book that was taught on the basis of precedent out of Judaism, in other words, you were constructing a theology coming out of Judaism, you could have had Jesus resurrected, but he would have been resurrected at the end in preparation for the end-time judgment. You wouldn't have him resurrected in the midst of history. So the question becomes, how do you explain this mutation in Jewish teaching of the resurrection? Where did it come from? Well, the best argument is that it came from because something happened that caused them to change the way they viewed their history. Because you could have had a surviving Messiah, you could have had him come back, you could have had him be the judge, and he could have functioned very easily and straightforwardly as the one who's responsible for the end-time judgment. And that all would have made good sense in Judaism. So if people who had come out of a Jewish background had made up the Jesus story out of a Jewish background, that would have been the way it would have looked. Instead, what we get is a figure raised within 3 days. Where does that come from? That's another example of the type of thing like we saw with, why would you create a story and have women be the first witnesses if you're trying to convince the culture of something difficult? You aren't going to have your witnesses who you create be people who don't count as witnesses. That doesn't make any sense.
You're going to want the most credible people you can find.
Exactly right. If you get to write the rules of the story, then you want to be sure that the rules are written in a way that the culture will appreciate.
Now, I assume from our previous conversations that you are a Christian.
Yes.
And now, have you ever pastored a church or?
I've served as an elder at a church, and I've interimed at a church, but I haven't served at a church full time. But I have been an elder at a church for over 20 years, and have functioned in a regular weekly ministry, taught Sunday school for that period, etc.
Okay. Now, are you Presbyterian? I'm assuming, since that's what you did in Greensboro.
I actually am in what's called an independent or a non-denominational church.
Okay. Fair enough. Now, you guys don't accept homosexuals in your church, do you?
No.
Okay. Hey, I had to press the button.
I don't even think we need to vote on it.
Okay, good. Anyway, I'm trying to get callers tonight. It's not working.
Bully them, right, Scott?
That's right. Wave the flag.
The letters coming in.
That's right. Politically correct. We don't do that here. So.
Yeah. Pretty crappy.
Yeah, that's right.
DC stands for.
Pretty crappy.
Anyway,
you know, but it's just amazing though that this one story. Now, I think Dan Brown writes a pretty good book.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, if it had just been a piece of fiction and he had presented it as a piece of fiction, I don't think many people would have blinked, and certainly you wouldn't have had all the Christian response and reaction to it. But it was his representation of the fact that this actually reflected real history. And I saw him. He was asked this question on national TV. I saw him answer it. And actually, when I saw him interviewed on Good Morning America, the day ABC ran a national special in the evening, and saw him answer the question, if you were writing nonfiction, would you change anything? And his answer was, no, basically I wouldn't change a thing.
Wow.
I'd write it the same way. That's when I decided if I had the chance, I would write a book on this, because I knew he was wrong.
Wow.
And I knew I couldn't get him to come to the seminary to take the class so he could get it right, so I figured, okay, well, we'll take the class to him.
I hear you. So did you debate Dan Brown then?
No, I actually have never debated him. There are shows that have wanted to get us on together, but he won't do it.
He's scared.
Yeah.
He's afraid that smiting rod's coming out. That's what it is.
That smiting rod is back in my office. I keep telling you that.
You could do the interview from the office, though.
Yeah. I don't. I'll let.
It looks more official with the books behind it.
He's really good at smiting, and I'll leave the job to him.
I hear you. Wow. I just don't know where to say after that. Well, you know, what do you think about? What do you feel? I know this is another off-topic. Did you have something, Trent?
Well, no. I guess maybe I'm working a little on less cylinders tonight. But
okay.
I mean, essentially, the whole notion that women, you know, basically that the Bible story is, or the resurrection story is, not really geared to like what the mass majority would want to believe, you know, in respect to, you know.
That's right. It cuts against the grain.
So, and it's done intentionally that way because you have to sort of go against, you know, common belief and perception to follow it, and you know, then there's a faith issue that comes.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing, and you know, another element of this story that's important is that it isn't told in such a way that Jesus does something and the people around him, the disciples, go, "Oh, another day, another miracle." You know,
right.
It's just Jesus. I tell my classes that the disciples around Jesus react to what he does much like a 21st century person would.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of doubt. There's a lot of hesitation. When those women come back to the disciples, their first take on it is, these women are hysterical. They're overcome with their grief.
Mm-hmm.
When the disciples report the appearance and Thomas isn't there, Thomas says, "I'm not going to believe it till I see it."
Yeah,
right.
You know, so you know the reaction comes from people who all have Ivy League degrees.
Well, that's a good segue for me, actually, and I was going to bring this up. You talk in your book about the resurrection of the body itself, and as far as you know, some of the examples you used, I think one of them might have been from Maccabees, where you talk about the kid having his hands cut off, and said, "Well, that's
right."
Yeah. Now, you know, and that thing, and then you know, it goes back to, you know, when you're reading the New Testament, a lot of times you see when Christ first approaches people, I think one on the road and some different things like that. It's like they don't recognize him at first, and that's because he's in I've always assumed that was because he was in a new spiritual body, but also obviously there are some things from the physical body there with the marks from the crucifixion. Now, how do you?
Yeah, that's when I tell my students I have no idea how that works.
Okay.
In other words, you know, the walking with the two on the Emmaus Road. He obviously has a long discussion with them. They have no idea who he is until the very end of that scene. When he appears to Mary Magdalene, at first she has no idea who he is. Finally, he says something to her, and she recognizes. It sounds like she recognizes his voice.
Okay.
You know, I don't know how the resurrection body works. You know, all that I know is that you know, Jesus suddenly appears in certain scenes, and he isn't always immediately recognizable. Now, when he appears to Paul, of course, Paul doesn't know what he looks like, and so he identifies himself to Paul. But then there are other scenes where he appears, and it seems like they know pretty immediately who he is. So So in some cases, it seems as if he grants, if you will, the perception of a recognition of who he is, and in other cases, it's not transparent immediately who he is. Of course, part of this, too, is related to the disciples' own expectations. It takes them a while to figure out when something surprising happens that could be Jesus, because in their minds, he's dead.
Yeah.
And so, they aren't looking for him, if you will.
No.
And they're not convinced when someone reports it. As I mentioned, when these women report that Jesus is raised, they think that they're being hysterical. But
Silly
Peter
woman.
does run out to the tomb. Well, the report after that is he looked in the tomb and it was empty, but he didn't see Jesus. And then later on, when the Emmaus disciples come back in Luke, by that time Jesus has appeared to Peter, and then they're convinced. So
now, how many people witnessed the ascension?
The ascension probably was something that took place in front of the 12. Well, in front of the 11.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Now, the Mormons would have us believe after the ascension. No, I'm not going to get into that.
United States.
Now, I do want to get into one other topic. We've got about 10 minutes left, and that topic is this whole Mary Magdalene Jesus thing. And we talked about, is that also one of these recreations from the whole French idea that we talked about earlier?
Well, let's separate it out into parts.
Okay.
I mean, yes, the idea that Mary Magdalene is the wife of Jesus is ultimately is part of this tradition that we've taught, this medieval tradition that comes from France. But let's do this in segments.
Okay.
Mary Magdalene in the Bible, basically, she's in 12 passages. Basically, 4 things are said about her. She's the beneficiary of a exorcism. She sees Jesus crucified. She sees where he's laid in a tomb. He appears to her. Those are the 4 things that basically happen to Mary Magdalene in the Bible. She's not a prostitute. That is something that came in 591, 592 A.D. with a sermon that Gregory the Great did, in which he made what's often a common confusion.
I did not know that.
Yes, it's something that comes in with common confusion, and it is to equate the Mary who anoints Jesus in the last week of his life with the sinful woman who anoints Jesus in the middle of his ministry. One passage is in Mark 12, the other passage is in Luke 7, and it's not the same event, and they're not the same figure, because Mary Magdalene is actually introduced as a new figure in Luke 8, in the beginning of Luke 8. And if she had been the one who had anointed Jesus, it would have been very simple for Luke to say, Mary Magdalene, the one who anointed Jesus and the one from whom Jesus performed an exorcism, but he doesn't do that.
Huh.
So she's not a prostitute. That is something that it crept in to the church tradition in the medieval period and has stuck. And so you can go through Europe, through the art museums, etc., and you'll see dozens of paintings with Mary Magdalene in which it's clear that she's being perceived as this immoral figure who's come out of immorality, that kind of thing. But that's not a part of who she was. She's also called, interestingly enough, an apostle by Hippolytus at the end of the 2nd century, but it doesn't mean apostle in the sense of the 12, because the generic term for apostle simply means someone who's commissioned with a message and who represents someone else. And when these women are told to go announce the resurrection to the disciples, they are apostles in that generic sense of the term. And Hippolytus calls the women to whom Jesus appears, not just Mary Magdalene, the apostles to the apostles, to indicate their role as witnesses to the resurrection.
Okay, I've got a question from a friend of mine sitting next to me. What does it, Mary? What does that say? I'm sorry. Was it a common name during that time?
Yes, Mary is a very common name. There are like 6 or 7 different Marys in the New Testament. But what's important about this discussion is the woman of Luke 7, who is the sinful woman, is never named in that passage. Okay? She's not named in that passage. Whereas the Mary who anoints Jesus in John 12, Mark 12 rather, and in the parallels, is in the last week of his life, is Mary, and she's the sister of Martha. Okay, it's obviously a pretty well-known disciple, and they're actually the sisters of Lazarus.
Okay.
Okay, so that's why you separate the two.
Wow. All right. Well, that's good. I'm glad we cleared that whole thing. I thought she was a prostitute. What a bad rap to get historically left with.
Seriously.
That's a bad tack. Did you know that?
That is. She's been the victim of very bad public relations. And we don't need to rehabilitate Judas. His PR is deserved.
Yeah.
But Mary Magdalene needs to have her reputation rehabilitated.
Why don't anybody write a book about that?
Well, actually, there have been people who've commented on who the real Mary Magdalene is. And in this ABC special that was done on the Da Vinci Code, actually got that information right as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, but they probably didn't get the rest of it right, though.
They didn't get what?
I said they probably didn't get the rest of it right, though.
Actually, that special was pretty well done.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they did a pretty good job. You know, one of the interesting things that happened with the Da Vinci Code is that when the secular reporters got onto all the books that were critiquing Dan Brown and they vetted the critique, they recognized that those who were critiquing Dan Brown had a lot more going for them historically than Dan Brown did, and they kind of turned on him.
Well, you know, I think it was hilarious. I don't know if you saw this, but I'm sure if you saw it, you would definitely remember seeing it because it's something that just sticks out like a sore thumb. I know a lot of the national media reports when this book of Judas first came out, a lot of the reporters just passed the information on. So they weren't calling them Gnostic text. They were calling it agnostic text. I thought it was so funny. I'm like, you guys are broadcasters, supposedly journalists, and you can't even get the word right.
What's going on is that there's stuff that's being renamed, and there is a debate in some segments of New Testament studies as to whether the term Gnostic is appropriate for these texts or not. And, of course, one section of my book, I have a chapter dedicated to that question to show that Gnostic is an appropriate term. In fact, there's a very well-known New Testament scholar, a guy named Berger Pearson, who's getting ready to write a book on Christian Gnosticism in which he also is going to make the case in a great deal of detail that the term is perfectly appropriate and should be kept.
Now, one other thing, we've got about 4 minutes left here. We're going to... I guess we need to wrap this up here pretty soon.
2-minute drill.
Yeah, we got. Yeah. I'm going to give you the final word. I just wanted to mention the fact that a lot of these Gnostic, if I'm not mistaken on this, a lot of these Gnostic groups, and they were. Your book definitely points out that they didn't have any kind of common ground as far as, they were scattered and there wasn't any kind of uniform orthodoxy about the Gnostic groups. But a lot of them, didn't they participate in weird sexual ceremonies and all kinds of other stuff?
Well, Gnosticism split into kind of two camps. There was a group that basically said, since my body is corrupt anyway, it's going to be destroyed. It doesn't matter what I do with it. They were very, very immoral. And the church fathers tended to talk about those groups as reflective of all of Gnosticism. But we also know from some of the material that we've dug up that some of the approach of some of them was, yes, my body's going to waste away, etc., but the whole point is to be spiritual, to not be attached to this world and the things that are corrupt about it. So there was a wing of Gnosticism that did attempt to be very moral, a more ascetic kind of Gnosticism, if you will. Mm-hmm. But you didn't hear quite so much about that because the immoral Gnostics were a little easier target.
Yeah, that's understandable.
You've always got your bad apples. They're more fun to pick on.
Exactly right.
Well, I'm going to give you the last word, Dr. Bock, and I want to thank you for coming on our program tonight and setting everybody straight.
Well, it's a real pleasure. I want to thank you for taking the time to do this. It's important that people understand this history, whether they're in the church or not, and it's important that the history be understood accurately, because so much of what is a reflection at the base of what Western culture is a product of aspects of this history. Mm-hmm. And to me, the rewriting of this history is not only about an attempt to redefine what the church is, it's also an attempt to redefine who we are culturally and in our cultural rootage and genealogy. And for that reason, it's a very important discussion that people need to appreciate, not just for the religious dimensions alone.
Well, thank you for coming on the show. That was Dr. Bock. You can purchase his book at Amazon.com, and the book title is The Missing Gospels, Unearthing the Truth Behind Alternative Christianities. Dr. Darrell Bock, it has been a pleasure.
Oh, I've enjoyed it immensely, and you guys enjoy your holiday season there in North Carolina.
Oh,
absolutely. You too, and I'm going to give you the non-politically correct Merry Christmas from here.
All right, there we go, and I'll say Happy Hanukkah.
Okay. All righty, fair enough. All right, take care, sir.
All right. You too. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye.
All right, that was
cool.
Dr. Darrell Bock. That was good stuff, man.
Yeah, man,
I told you he was going to be a great guest.
I know. We need to bring.
Yeah, we got to bring him back.
Hopefully, we can get him back on.
Yeah, I don't know what you guys out there feel like. Hey, sign up for our mailing list, okay?
Sign up.
We've only had about 30,000 sign up. No, I'm kidding. We did. I wish we had that many. That'd be something to put out, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
now, we've only had a handful of people sign up there. I'm not going to give any numbers because it makes me sound pathetic and weak. Now, we've had about 20 people sign up, and it's only been up a few days. But I know we get lots of traffic on the site, but it just seems like you guys don't want to have our newsletter. It's going to be totally non-politically correct. No, I'm kidding. Trent's going to write it, so it'll probably be liberal.
I'm going to tone down all that crap because Scott's not going to. I'm not going to write anything about Mexicans or homosexuals. I mean, I'm going to write about the show, and I'm going to write about the guests. I'm going to write about paranormal stuff.
Show, guest, paranormal.
Political soapboxing for your special show, Dr. Scott's World of
whatever, yeah,
hating.
So, World of Hating. Oh my gosh! Wait, don't say that. I'm going to get sued by somebody and have to pay.
From the real doctor.
Yeah, somebody does. They're like, wait a minute,
hating.
I have the World of Hate
somewhere.
here. Yeah, no, and it's not that I hate people. I just like to spell it out and say, America, open your eyes to what's going on out there. Look for yourself. And, a lot of these special groups out there, they don't want equal treatment. They want special privileges, and that's something that we shouldn't give them.
That is definitely gearing towards oh gosh, who was that guy? Anyway,
some dude.
I want to say Aristotle might have been Plato talking about democracy being basically mob rule.
Yeah, it is the rule of the mob.
But essentially, that's where it kind of goes towards.
I agree.
I'm just going to leave that. That's my one little comment, and I'm just going to leave it.
The only constitutional law precept.
Sign up for the newsletter.
Sign up for the newsletter around the front page, worldoftheunexplained.com.
Just clicky. It's right there. It won't take you a second.
The only constitutional law precept that people are given the right to have their opinions voiced and be law is the obscenity rule. That's the only thing in the country. In constitutional law, it is a community standard. It's a jury question.
Wow.
That's the only time they care about what we think.
Very interesting. We're like a minute over, by the way.
Is what? I know we're a minute over, but I don't care.
Yeah, I know you don't, Scott.
We're gonna get at. He makes fun of my Chihuahua shirt.
I mean, I'll get a matching boxer shirt.
I like the Chihuahua shirt. I like it. I like the Chihuahua shirt. Guys, remember, we're having this conference. I'm going to plug it one more time, and then we're getting out of here. June the 9th, 2007. I'll have information available on worldoftheunexplained.com as soon as we can. John Zaffis, Bill Sneblin, the ex-vampire, myself, and Trent and Chuck, Laura from Full Moon Radio, Dr. Al Prophet, and author Teresa Bain, Actual Factual Dracula. She's going to be our guest in April. We're all going to be in Greensboro, North Carolina, June the 9th, 2007. It's going to be an all-day event. You can purchase your tickets there, $50 each. A very amazing deal for an all-day event. And we're going to have some other VIP tickets available for those of you that want to dine with us after the conference. So check into that. We'll have more information as it comes, but that's the definite date. Guys, this is Jay Scott, your only JD DJ on the Planet Paranormal Network.
This is Trent Lackey. We're coming to you from Kernersville, North Carolina, a small town where we talk about big things.
Chuck!
We out.